Earlier in our course, we explored the writings and ideas of the Greek philosopher Plato. And those writings and ideas were enormously influential in philosophical and theological thought over the next 2,400 years or so. And that means down to the very present moment. In antiquity, the ideas of Plato continued to be discussed and examined and refined after Plato's death, as the early phase of Platonism passed to what is known as the period of Middle Platonism, where Platonic ideas engaged and incorporated elements from the Stoics and from Aristotle and other philosophical schools. And then a new phase in Platonic thought emerged in the 3rd century of the current era with the philosopher Plotinus. And Plotinus was so influential that his ideas designate a new phase in the Platonic tradition, which we call NeoPlatonism. Though this term, NeoPlatonism, likewise for Middle Platonism, they were never used prior to the modern era. They were all just Platonists. We just categorize these periods as Platonist, Middle Platonism, and then here, Neoplatonism. It's all just modern. Plotinus was from Egypt, and he studied in Alexandria under a great teacher named Ammonius Saccas, who influenced many students, but Plotinus left Alexandria in order to go to Rome to teach philosophy. Today, we access the ideas of Plotinus thanks to one of his students, a Platonic thinker named Porphyry, and Porphyry encouraged Plotinus to put his ideas down in writing, which Porphyry then gathered and arranged. This is after Plotinus' death. He arranged them into 6 books. In each of the 6 books, he made 9 essays. And so the work of Plotinus with Porphyry editing here is known as the Aeneids, which means the nines. So that's from the Greek word for 9. Porphyry also wrote a biography of Plotinus in which he tells us that he, Porphyry, was by far Plotinus' best student. And we learn other details about Plotinus, like he wanted to found a community called Platonopolis, which would be based on the laws of Plato. That didn't come to pass. What Porphyry may have lacked in humility, he made up for in dedication to Plotinus and in his own philosophical contributions in this Neoplatonic tradition, and his contributions were significant. What did Plotinus teach? Well, Plotinus taught that the source of everything that is, the source is called the One. And this is like Plato's the good or the beautiful, and it's the source of all reality. Now, those in a theistic tradition like Christianity or Judaism or Islam, for that matter, might think of this as God. And emanating from the One, and here you can imagine by way of metaphor, a fountain where the water fills up the container and then flows over the top. Or by way of another metaphor, think of the sun. There is the sun, but it's radiating rays of light. Here, emanating from the One is the intellect or the mind. This is nous in Greek, so you can translate it intellect or divine mind, either way. And in this divine mind are those forms, those Platonic forms that the image of the perfect reality is there, existing in the divine mind. Now, the mind, looking at the One, is in a state of contemplation, but when it looks away, it also emulates the One in its own act of emanation or creation, and this produces the soul. So you have the One, the divine mind, and now there's the soul. This is the Neoplatonic Trinity. The soul, then, also has this twofold activity. On the one hand, it looks back to the mind out of which it emerged, but when it looks away, it also wants to create, to emulate the divine mind. But here, is where the problem begins. Now that we are 3 steps removed from the one, when the soul creates, it does so by using the forms which are in the mind of God. So again, it's looking back, contemplating the mind of God. There are the forms. The soul then creates with those forms in mind, but it uses those forms as the architectural model on matter. And matter is not a good building material. It is flawed and corruptible, unlike the one, the mind, and the soul. Now, individual humans contain souls which had turned away from contemplating the intellect or mind and fell into an embodied state. Therefore, humans have the capacity to ascend in purity by recognizing the need to direct their own soul back to the world soul, back to the mind of God, through their understanding, which becomes evident through their actions. Now, Christian thinkers found in Neoplatonic thought much of value for the explanation of Christian theological truths. Now, in this use of Platonic thought, they had Jewish precedent to draw upon, and this is most evident in the example of the Jewish author whom I've already talked about earlier in the course, Philo of Alexandria, and he lived about the years 20 BCE to 50 CE, meaning his life overlaps with that of Jesus and Paul. And Philo studied Platonic thought, and he used this to explain the Bible. He studied other philosophical traditions. In fact, he's in the era of Middle Platonism, when Platonic thought is engaging with Stoics and Aristotelian thought and other traditions. So let me give you an example. In his work on the creation of the world, Philo examines how God orders the universe through his word, through his reason, which we can think about in light of Plotinus's intellect or divine mind. In this view, creation and all that exists comes from God through the Logos, and that the Logos creates according to a blueprint in its mind. It's not random. Everything created is according to some ideal, and here we can see an expression of Plato's forms, which Plotinus has in the divine mind, which provides that blueprint of creation. But what is the Logos in the biblical tradition? Well, Philo can point to the book of Proverbs. And so let's turn to Proverbs chapter 8. And there we see wisdom is speaking. And wisdom says, in verse 12, I, wisdom, dwell with prudence, and I possess knowledge and discretion. In verse 22, the Lord created me as the firstborn of his ways, before the oldest of his works. I was established in the earliest times, at the beginning, before the earth I was brought forth, when there were no springs overflowing with water, before the mountains had been shaped. And it continues on. When he set the heavens in place, I was there. When he fixed the canopy of the clouds above and limited the foundations of the deep. When he assigned the boundaries of the sea. And when he established the foundations of the earth. I'm skipping a bit in chapter 8. Then I was beside him as a master craftsman. And I was his delight day after day, exulting in his presence continually. Wisdom, or reason, is the Logos of God, through whom creation comes about, we see here in Proverbs. And Philo sees here the act of creation by God mediated through wisdom, through the Logos, the very reason of God, which sounds quite Platonic, especially in light of Plotinus's later explanation. And Christians see here the work of the Logos of God, which they view as incarnated as Jesus. So when the Christians read Proverbs, they see an understanding of Jesus explicated in that 8th chapter. Now let me provide another example of Platonic thought to biblical text. And for this, let's turn to this foundational story of Adam and Eve and the serpent in the Garden of Eden. And this story is found in your course reading. Philo explained a deeper meaning beyond the literal surface, superficial reading of the text. For him, Adam represented the mind, Eve represented the senses, and the serpent represented pleasure. And so pleasure deceived the senses, which steered the mind astray. And this is a Platonic reading of Genesis, with the mind steered to pleasure and disobedience by the weakness of the senses. And expanding our vision beyond Genesis to the whole Exodus narrative, Philo can portray the story of the Israelite escape from slavery in Egypt under Moses' leadership as the story of the soul's escape from enslavement to pleasure, to a higher way of being. Now, let's return to Plotinus. In his explanation, our true personhood, our true self, is found in the soul, and our ideal way of living is found in the contemplation of our soul and turning back to the mind of God. We have a deep spirituality in the Neoplatonic tradition, which sees beyond the physical appearances to looking to the mind of God and beyond to the one, which cannot be seen or expressed. It can only be experienced. But this is possible only after much contemplative practice, and even Plotinus only experienced this state a few times in his entire life. So what happens at death? The soul leaves the body. Now, even the Christian tradition agrees here. But then these two traditions diverge. For Plotinus, the world of matter, remember, is this corruptible sensory realm. The soul is liberated from that, and the soul can return to the soul of God, that divine soul, to be in contemplation of the mind of God. That's what it looks forward to. Leaving the body behind, and the body rots and disintegrates. Of course, if the soul doesn't achieve that liberation, it's going to be once again embodied and has to live out. So we have this experience of the soul's return to a new body if it doesn't get it right. But for Christian, the soul also separates from the body at death. But at the end of time, Christians teach, the body of each person will be resurrected and reunited with the soul, a perfected, glorified body that, in body and soul, will live forever in reward or in punishment. Thus, the Christian and the Jewish traditions affirm the identity of each person as body and soul, where the Neoplatonic sees the body as a shell to be left by the soul. And we can contrast this in the death of Socrates and Jesus. In Plato's telling, death is where Socrates' soul left his body, and that was the end of Socrates. But in the New Testament, at Jesus' death, his soul may have left his body, but it returned on the third day when his body and soul were reunited, and he was resurrected to encounter his disciples before ascending to heaven in a glorified body. Now, this is quite the contrast between Platonist and Christian thought. Thus, in the first century, when the Apostle Paul preached this message in Athens, the Greek intellectuals who listened to him as he was explaining Christianity, they burst out laughing when he talked about a physical resurrection, a resurrection of the body, which seemed to them comical, entirely absurd, crude, and ignorant. But one of those intellectuals, a man named Dionysius the Areopagite, was intrigued, and we learn from Acts of the Apostles that Dionysius converted to Christianity. Now, nothing more is known about him until the 6th century of the current era. We begin to hear of Christian texts by Dionysius the Areopagite. And these texts explain the faith in terms of celestial hierarchies which radiate from God. That is, the texts that are attributed to this Dionysius the Areopagite are Neoplatonic explanations of Christianity. Now, I should be clear, these texts were not written by Dionysius the Areopagite that's mentioned in Acts of the Apostles. These texts are Neoplatonic explanations which were attributed to him. Yet, there is much for Neoplatonists to object in this rival tradition of Christianity. In the 2nd century, the philosopher Celsus wrote an anti-Christian treatise called On the True Word, or On the True Doctrine, because Christians clearly don't have it, so he wants to explain it. And for him, Moses just corrupted the existing truths of philosophers and non-Jewish religions, whereas Christians then followed an ignorant sorcerer whose mother was an adulteress. Yes, there's this biting anger from this Platonic thinker against these Christian upstarts. And Plotinus' successor Porphyry also wrote a treatise against the Christians. In fact, in Porphyry's work, one of the many areas that he addresses is the apocalyptic text that we already have looked at, the book of Daniel. And Porphyry explains that this text, while it purports to be from the period of the Babylonian exile, predicting the future, was really from the time of the Greek ruler Antiochus IV and the era of the Maccabean rebellion, and it was simply talking about the present. That is, he's not only countering Christian and Jewish religious ideas, he's attacking the very texts on which those ideas were grounded. Now, in turn, Christians wrote treatises refuting the Neoplatonic assault, defending their faith and countering the arguments made against them. And you see this, for example, with Origen of Alexandria, who wrote a treatise against Celsus. Origen is working in the 3rd century, and Origen was another student of Ammonius Saccas, like Plotinus, but whereas Plotinus had no interest in Christianity, Origen was the greatest Christian mind of the 3rd century. St. Augustine in the 5th century also, in his City of God, for example, offered extensive engagement with and refutation of Neoplatonic ideas. Yet what this amounts to is an ongoing dialogue between the two traditions. And through this, we find Platonic ideas becoming useful for Christian theologians in thinking through and explaining the Christian faith. But let me conclude with one fundamental difference between the Neoplatonic and the religious traditions founded in the Bible. The Neoplatonic image of the divine in the form of the one and the mind and the soul, that Neoplatonic Trinity, if you will, it's entirely impersonal. The relationship between human identity and the divine realm is impersonal. Whereas in the traditions we've looked at that are expressed in the biblical narrative, there is, if anything, clear relationship between the divine and the human, and that relationship was infused with emotion, frustration, and anger, compassion, and love. And we've seen this in our course from Abraham and Moses to Job and Jesus. When Christians borrowed Neoplatonic ideas, they had to infuse them with the personal relationship, which was their understanding of the bond between the divine and the human.